Our first speaker today is Bob Veninga. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much. Several weeks ago, one of my close friends sent me a printed sermon, and he wrote on the front, "What do you think?" And I started to read the printed sermon, and here was the first line: "May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart." I just pray that all the medications out there and up here are working very good today. My friends, I want to talk to you today out of my heart. Whenever I use that phrase with my graduate students at the University of Minnesota, I can almost always see them roll their eyeballs like, is anything going to come out of the head? I don't know if anything's going to come out of the head, but I do hope some things come out of the head. But what I want to talk to you about out of my heart are the things that I've learned about stewardship, primarily in higher education. And so what I'm going to do is kind of give a frame of reference about what we know about stewardship from higher education, but I really hope to liberally sprinkle in examples in terms of being a layperson in our church. Every once in a while, you find a book that just kind of stirs your soul. My field at the University of Minnesota is management and leadership, and so I'm always looking for new books. Books that can have some historical truths to it, but books that have some new insights. And I'm sure all of you just long to have a new book that gives you some material for meditations for your own personal life. I'd like to recommend one book to you this morning that has stirred my own soul, and it's called The Hasidic Master's Guide to Management and Leadership. It is written by a gentleman and author in Israel who's a top-flight executive of a major company in Israel. He's writing this for the equivalent of Fortune 500 executives, but I want to tell you that what he's writing about has immense implications for those of us who care and those of us who love the church. What this book is all about is essentially Hasidic stories, Jewish stories, folk tales that go way back. Some of them go back 1,000 years. And what he does is he takes these folk stories and he says, okay, now what do these folk stories have to say to us today, men and women who work in the modern organization? I want to start out with the first folk story that he talks about. And just to kind of give you a little picture about what's happening, it happens to be 3 students who are studying in a seminary. How appropriate. And they are studying under a famous rabbi when all of a sudden something unexpected occurs. One day, the students of Rabbi Bear were sitting in the study hall of the Jewish seminary. Suddenly, someone shouted with alarm, "Kidnappers, kidnappers! They have taken Yosef Isaacs, a beloved friend of this community. The kidnappers demand a ransom of 600 coins, and there is no way to find 600 gold coins. Even if every Jew in our community donated all of his worldly possessions, it would not come to 600 gold coins." But one of the Jewish students, a young man by the name of Shinir, said, "There is a way to raise the coins. There's one person in town that has that much money. His name is Velville." "Velville," snorted the student. "He will not give. He left the Jewish people years ago. He even has dogs to protect them from outsiders." "Even so," said Shinir, "I believe he is going to help." 2 of Shinir's friends insisted on coming. "You may join me on one condition," said Shinir. "You must remain silent and let me alone speak to Velville." They agreed to remain silent. They knocked as Velville opened the door. Velville was surprised and angered by the sign of the Jewish students. "I see," he said, "the Jews have forgotten how much I despise their visits. I will have to get more dogs." Shanur said, "Please hear me out. We've come on an urgent mission." Shanur explained how Yosef had been kidnapped and how his life was in danger. They said that they could not pay the ransom without Velvo's help. Velvo was moved by the sincerity of the plea. "You have shown great courage to come," he said. "Thank you very much," Shanur said to Velvo. "May God reward you for your part in helping save a life." There was no irony in Shanur's voice, only sincere gratitude. With that, Shanur turned to leave, and he heard Velvo's voice, "Wait, perhaps I can find something else in the house to contribute." A few minutes later, Velvo reappeared and gave 2 pennies. Again, Shanur was effusive with praise, and they turned to leave. Velvo called them back a 3rd time and gave them 10 pennies. The 4th time, a gold coin. The 5th time, 5 gold coins. And each time, Shanur was genuinely thankful without a hint, a reproof in his voice. They did not leave until Velvo gave 600 gold coins. As the 3 students walked to town, one asked Shanur, "How did you know that our mission would be so successful?" Shanur replied, "I knew that Velvo had within him the strength to give the entire sum, if only he could give the first penny." His problem was that no one was willing to take the first penny from him. Once I took it with sincere gratitude and encouragement, the well springs were opened up, and he was able to give the entire amount. Now, folks, what I want to focus in on today is, how do you get people to give the first penny? How do you get people who are marginally connected with your church, either theologically or financially? How do you get them to give the first penny? Now, yesterday, we had wonderful discussions about expanding our understanding of stewardship. And I was moved by the comments. And I would say that from the context of my own life, it really is important to really expand our knowledge about what stewardship is all about. However, for this morning, I want to focus first on money. In order to get people to give the first penny, it's really important to discover new financial wells. Some of you are from North Dakota here, and you can speak more eloquently than I about what is taking place in North Dakota. But it is absolutely amazing with all the new riches that are coming from the oil. About 14 years ago, my wife and I moved to Veninga Heights, Minnesota, and I was a little concerned about a railroad track that was about a mile from our house. And the real estate agent said, "Oh, you have nothing to worry about. That's a sleepily railroad. Maybe one train will come by a day." Today we hear rail traffic morning, noon, and night with whistles. And what is it? It's oil that is coming from the state of North Dakota. Geologists, however, will tell you that as rich as those oil wells are now, there is going to come a time when those wells are going to dry up, or when it becomes cost prohibitive to be able to mine that rich resource. Now, financial wells in churches and in nonprofit organizations dry up too. People move from your church to another congregation. People die, and their kids don't have the same philanthropic interests that their parents or their grandparents once had. People get demoted, or they lose their jobs and they can't fulfill the pledge. Or sometimes people get offended by the sermons that you preach, or they get offended by the stance that the church council is taking on a particular social issue. and all of a sudden that well has driven up. I dare say that for any pastor in this room who's been in the ministry 10 or 15 years or more, you could probably speak eloquently when all of a sudden a financial well that you were counting on year after year, all of a sudden it's not there anymore. And my guess is there's not a pastor who would say that a lot of prayer went in when those wells dried up as to how is the church going to go on, particularly if it was a major donor. Therefore, what I want to say initially here is that it is the job of the CEO of the church, the pastor, but it is even more the job of lay people, key lay people who can keep their confidence, lay people that you trust, to really go out and discover new wells. Now, you may rightly say to me, Bob, you can't imagine how much time I have given in my church to discover new wells. And I don't doubt that for a minute. But I want to say something to you kindly and gently. My experience with pastors in multiple denominations is that they often do not know where the new financial wells are located. Pastors may know the intimacies of people's lives, but oftentimes they do not know the intimacies of people's pocketbook. And so the question is, if that in fact is true, how do you locate those new financial wells? And I think the answer again is that you need to turn to trusted lay people that can keep confidences, lay people that you trust, lay people who really know the lives of people in your congregation for help. Several years ago, I was on our church council, and we were having some real financial dilemmas. And the Saturday night before a Sunday, we had an emergency meeting of the church council, and we were talking about staff members that we needed to cease their employment in order to balance the budget. And I came to church on that Sunday with a really heavy heart. And as the church service began, I saw the people who are staff members who were so diligent and who were carrying so much of the load of our church. And I knew the previous night, in confidence, our church council was talking about various individuals and letting people go. I'll tell you frankly, I don't think I heard a word about what the message of the day was. I kept thinking, how do we get out of this dilemma? As we were singing the last hymn, I happened to look around, and on the other side of the congregation was the chief executive officer of one of the larger Twin Cities companies. And I thought to myself, should I take him into my confidence? And I decided to do so. And so after church was over, I said, do you have a few minutes that we could talk? He said, sure. And so we went into the church library, and he looked at me and he says, what's on your heart? And I said, well, what's on my heart is that the reliable financial wells that we've turned to again and again for this church, some of them are gone, or some of them aren't producing what they used to produce. And he says, yes, I've heard of the dilemma by way of the grapevine. And I said, we are at the point where we're going to have to let some people go. Is there anything that you can do to help? And he thought a minute and he says, I will help financially, of course. But he says, let me think about this overnight. I just love people who say, let me think about this overnight. And I knew I could tell by looking into his eyes that he was thinking creatively. The next morning I went to my computer, got my email on, and there was a message. And he said, here are the names of 5 individuals who I think could help us through the crisis. And he gave the names of the individuals. And he signed his name, and then there was this wonderful P.S. And he says, if it's okay with you and the pastor, I'd like to call on these people myself. Is it okay with the pastor right here? I kid you not, folks. All 5 of them gave. And 2 of the 5 gave significantly. And one of the most interesting facts about that example is that 2 of the 5 were not members of our church. They are now members of the church, I can assure you. Well, how did it all happen? A couple weeks later, I saw this wonderful layperson. I said, how did this all happen? And he said to me, they were just waiting to be asked. That's how you discover the first penny. I want to say, in working in higher education, one of the things that I've had to fight again and again is that perception that the money is not there. And it becomes a real trap when all of a sudden you think we don't have the financial resources. And I'd be the first to admit in my own career there are times when that is actually absolutely true. But more often than not, there are financial resources, but somehow we have to get to the first penny. Now, I know that there are incredible pockets of poverty in this country. And I know that there are people in your churches who are unemployed and who would have a great difficulty giving any kind of a pledge at all. But here are the objective facts. The baby boomer generation during the next 10 years, going back to 2011, will inherit $81.4 trillion. And that will average $300,000 per household. And so what we know is that we're going to have a big wealth transfer taking place. In the next 10 years, 10 million, get that statistic, 10 million new millionaires will be created, which comes down to 3,000 per year. Now I know what you're thinking, Lord, just send me one of those millionaires. The actress Gracie Allen, who was married to the comedian George Burns. You remember George Burns with the cigar, tapping it all the time? And Gracie Allen was always kind of the dim-witted one, you know. That was the gig that they had going on. She was actually the smart one in the relationship. And she once made the comment, never put a period where God has placed a comma. Never put a period by saying all the financial wells have been tapped. Because I want to assure you most of the time, what God has put there is a comma. Now, before leaving this point too quickly, what I want to say is that we're really talking about building relationships, meaningful relationships, lasting relationships, and most of all, trusting relationships. The longer I live, the more I think it all boils down to human relationships, particularly for young people. Several years ago, I was teaching a class of 200 freshmen, and I love to teach freshmen. But when you have 200, it's very difficult to get to know their names. And so the very first class, I got there early because I wanted to make sure the PowerPoint was working and the classroom looked all picked up and we were ready for the kids to come. And I got there, and right in front on the very first row was a young man who you could tell was just absolutely dressed for success. He was wearing a blue blazer and khaki pants, and he looked very eager, and he was just sitting there, and he had his notebook right in front of him, and he had the name of the course and then the name of the instructor, my name. And so I introduced myself to him. I said, "Who are you?" And he says, "My name is so-and-so. I'm from Grundy Center, Iowa." Anybody know where Grundy Center, Iowa is? All right, okay. Grundy Center, Iowa. He says, "I'm a freshman." He says, "I'm training to be a hospital administrator." I says, "That's absolutely fantastic." The second day I came to class, there he was again. Now, he was dressed more like a normal teenager was at that time, but he was dressed very nicely. And so every time I came to class, he was the first student there, and we got to talking with one another. Best of all, he was a fantastic student and did well on his grades. So this went on all semester long. And then at the end of the semester, I said to him, his name's Harry. I said, "Harry," he said, I'm really intrigued. "Why are you the first student here all the time, since the beginning of the class?" And he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye, and he said, "Because 4 years from now, I'm going to need a letter of recommendation." It should not surprise anybody in this room that he is now the president of one of the major health systems in this country. Everything hinges on relationships. Now, the second point I'd like to make, and it's a very important one, and it's something that I think we can learn from nonprofit organizations, and that is how important it is to link all financial appeals to the heart. I cannot overemphasize the importance of linking financial appeals to the heart. I'm sure you've heard the description of what happens when you cross a Jehovah Witness with a Lutheran. They knock at the door, but no one speaks. I want to say we have to speak much louder about what is taking place in our congregations, and we've got to link it to the heart. Every successful nonprofit organization that I've worked with that knows the meaning of stewardship and is connecting with people, and they're not worried every single day about the budget. They know how to connect the appeals to people's hearts, not just their minds, as important as that is, but to their hearts. I think, for example, close to home at the University of Minnesota, we have what's called the University of Minnesota Foundation. And the University of Minnesota Foundation every year has a dinner to raise money for the medical school and for the hospital. And every one of those dinners, they have patients, former patients, families of patients, talk about what the hospital meant and what the physicians meant. And I tell you, it turns out to be very moving. The last one I went to, I'll never forget it. It was a mom and dad with their 3-year-old child who obviously was born with severe congenital problems. And first the dad thanked the audience for all they have done to support the medical school and the hospital. And then the mom gave her testimony about what the physicians and what the nurses meant. And I want to tell you, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. I came home and my wife said to me, "How did the meeting go?" And I said, "We're $200 poor, but I feel $2,000 richer." We need to link in ways that are much stronger our appeals to the heart. Now, in a way, folks, this should be the easiest task of the pastor, of the church council, the finance committee, the leadership to do. This should be the easiest task we do, and that is to let people know what is happening in the lives of people in our congregation, to give testimonies. I was raised as a Baptist, and I can tell you there wasn't a meeting that went by where we did not have a testimony. And I can remember as a kid, I'd forget all the words that came from the pulpit, but I would not forget when the farmer talked about what God was doing in his life on the farm, or when the teenager talked about what was happening in the high school. That I remember, and I think we could take a page out of the Pentecostal book and say, what is real in people's lives are the testimonies about what is helping people not just survive the challenges of life, but to thrive on them. There is nothing as powerful in the life of a church as somebody that gets up and says, "I want you to know, folks, I am so thankful because of what God is doing in my life right now." In the church that I attend, we have what's called dessert gatherings in the fall. And it's pledge time. And so we have these dessert gatherings. Last year we had 7 of them. And we videotaped one of our teenagers, a junior in high school in Matamidi, Minnesota. And this teenager gave a moving testimony about what God was doing in her life. And she talked about the pressures of being a high school student, which I think many of us in the audience didn't quite understand and grasp until she started talking about it. What does it mean to be a high school student surrounded by other high school students? What does it mean to have to be able to do well on ACT scores to get into the college of your choice? What does it mean when you start to be bullied by kids? And she talked right out of her heart. And then she got all choked up on the video. And she could barely speak, and she says, "And I got to tell you one other thing. I almost committed suicide this past year, but I didn't, because the church has a peer minister, and we got together, and the peer minister helped me get through it." I happened to be on the little elevated platform watching the members in the audience. And as I watched, and after the video was over, the pastor took out the pledge cards and passed it around. And normally what people do is they just kind of put down the number because they've been thinking about it before they came in. And what was amazing, each of those 7 nights, I could see people not putting the number down, but I could see them thinking. And I could see husbands and wives talking to one another. And while I have no way of knowing, I would be willing to bet what little money I have in my billfold right now, what they were talking about was, can't we do better? Can't we do better? The poet Maya Angelou has these wonderful words. And for many years, I have had these on my computer. And when I go into the classroom, and I'm so eager for the students to get the content, I always reread these words to myself. I have learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. Now, the third point I want to leave with you is very important, and that is to remember the two of the most important words in the English language, and that is thank you. I really do believe that people in our culture are dying in spirit because they do not hear the words thank you. Several weeks ago, I was doing a seminar for one of the largest companies in the Twin Cities. It was for their middle managers. There were about 100 of them at their international training room here in the Twin Cities, a beautiful room equipped with all the latest technologies. And it was an 8 to 12 seminar. And the first 2 hours were just going well. And there was a woman sitting right in front. And I could tell she was into the content. She was taking notes. She was a professor's dream. I mean, she was really taking notes out there. And she was asking pertinent questions. And then at 10 o'clock, we took a brief break. And so for 15 minutes, they could do whatever they wanted to do. And then we started to reassemble. And I saw this woman come down who was so energized and energetic. And she came down. And she was looking at a piece of paper, and she sat down by her in front of her desk, and for the next 2 hours, she never looked up once at the front of the room. She was simply looking down at that piece of paper. She wasn't engaged at all. I was really intrigued, and I debated, should I say anything? After the seminar was over, I said I wanted to find out what was going on. And I said to her, I said, Miss, forgive me for... I don't mean to indulge in your private life, but I said the first 2 hours you were so into the content. You were learning, you were growing. I could just tell it. You were asking wonderful questions. In the last 2 hours, what I saw you was staring at a piece of paper. And she says, well, at break time, I went out to my mailbox and I got my performance review of the day. And she said, would you like to read it? And I said, sure. And so it said, dear Miss So-and-so, this past year, you have completed 3 tasks. And then it ended and said, as you know, we are having financial difficulties in this company, and so this year we are not awarding any raises. And that was it. And so I looked at the letter, and then I looked at her, and I said, well, probably what's got you upset was that there's not going to be any salary increase. And she looked at me, and her eyes welled with tears, and she said, no. What I was hoping for was a simple thank you. I want to tell you parenthetically, last week I went out for breakfast with one of my closest friends, and he said, what are you excited about this summer? And this is the truth. I said, what I'm excited about is next Tuesday, because I'm going to talk about things I care about to a wonderful group of people at Luther Seminary on stewardship. And he became very pensive, and he said to me, last March, I made a major contribution to our church, and I have yet to receive a thank you. Now, my friends, I want to say that one of the most important things is to say thank you to people who are giving in your church. I believe that every church should have a thank you committee. And I think that thank you committee can be as powerful as your church council or as your stewardship committee or your finance committee. A thank you committee. A committee that is talking about how do we thank people for the work they're doing. Not just simply the money that they're giving, as important as that, but people who need to be awarded and rewarded, at least verbally, for the time that they're giving in teaching kids confirmation or coaching a church softball team. I want to tell you, when people are thanked genuinely, it has an overpowering experience on their psyche. I want to tell you, when I say to my students after one of them or two of them do exceptionally well in class, let's go over to Kaufman Student Union, I got something to tell you. And they're all wondering, what's going to tell us? And I say to them, man, I know you studied like crazy in order to get an A+ on that exam. I just want to take you out for coffee and say, I thank you. When the students write up their evaluations and have had that experience, they often don't talk about the content in the class. What they talk about is the fact that we went out for a cup of coffee and they knew that their teacher understood how hard they work. During the height of the recession, the church I belonged to was not able to give out a salary increase for 3 consecutive years. And if there's one thing that I learned from that experience is how hard it is on staff when they do not get a salary increase at all. They didn't complain. They were not bitter about it. But I could tell it was very, very disappointing. And so we were coming up to the 4th year in a row, and I'll never forget the church council meeting. The church council meeting was, we can't do it the 4th year in a row. And then one of the council members says, I think there's something that we can do. He says, let's go back over the budget. And we had a small surplus. It wasn't big. He says, we could give a thank you check to every one of our staff members. And so we decided unanimously to give a thank you check. It wasn't big. It was what it symbolized. It wasn't big, but it was what it symbolized. And I want to tell you, I'll never forget the Sunday after they got their letter with the check in it. A janitor in our church came up to me. He says, I can never thank the church council enough. He says, I've been working as a janitor in churches for 43 years. And he says, this is the first time anybody ever gave me a thank you letter. And he said, a personal note that came with it. My friends, I want to say we need to rethink our way of saying thank you for what people are doing for the church. How do you maintain a spirit of gratitude in our church? Because I really believe that stewardship, financial giving, really comes out of hearts that are filled with gratitude and they're overflowing. And that the more we create that culture in the church of gratitude, the better off we are. I close with telling you about an amazing experience we had in our church this winter. At our Wednesday night service, which incidentally I've been told is the fastest growing church service among ELCA churches in the nation, and we've discovered that to be true as well. On a Wednesday evening, we had Billy Steele. Billy Steele is a black singer who features gospel music. He's won Grammy Awards. And so at the height of the service, he just started playing gospel music. And as the gospel music wafted into our congregation, you could see people almost relax. And then as he was playing softly, the most beautiful gospel songs, he started to give his testimony. And I'll never forget about all the hard things he had to face in life, and yet how God had blessed him with his voice and with his singing and playing ability. And then he said to the members of the congregation, he says, I want to play for you my favorite gospel hymn. And it was a gospel hymn I had never heard of up to that point in time. And the title of that hymn is, God, if you don't do anything else for me, you've done enough. I'm sure, my friends, all of us can resonate to that. If God didn't do anything else for us, he's done enough. He's blessed each of us probably in ways that we could not have fathomed when we were 20 or 21 years old. I know that in a group this size that there are some of you, and I know this from talking with you, that during this past year have gone through some deep water. And yet I would say, my guess is that every one of you would say, in spite of the deep water, God, even if you don't do anything else for us, you've done enough. However, my friends, the good news is this. My strong hunch is that God is not done with us. He's not done with you, and he's not done with me, and he's not done with the churches that we love and we care about. Thanks be to God.